Imagine waking to the sound of waves and an unfamiliar sail on the horizon. Would you run, observe, or confront? Today we step into the shoes of the Wampanoag, navigating the first encounters with European strangers along the Atlantic shores. June 12, 1621. On the cold soils of the Atlantic shores in what is now Massachusetts, the wind carried a sharp tang of salt and the damp scent of earth. Waves lapped rhythmically against the shoreline, spilling over smooth, sun-warmed stones. Long wooden canoes rested on the sand paddles, glistening with seawater. The Wampanoag moved with measured steps, hands gripping ropes, eyes scanning the horizon. The cries of gulls mingled with the rustle of pine trees inland, a symphony of the familiar and the wild. Children darted along the beach, picking up shells or smooth pebbles, but their attention was never far from a group of strangers standing atop a distant ridge, observing every movement of the canoes. Those distant figures were not the first Europeans the Wampanoag had seen, yet something was different this time. Their stance, the way they raised flags and gestured toward the shore, suggested intent, a deliberate presence that could no longer be ignored. The air seemed to hold its breath. Every ripple in the water, every whisper through the reeds, carried the tension of a moment that could reshape the land. The community knew that the coming hours would test their knowledge, their vigilance, and the very continuity of their lives along these shores. By the summer of 1621, the Atlantic shores had become a stage upon which forces far beyond the horizon were beginning to act. The Wampanoag had known these waters, these marshes, and these forests for generations. Canoes glided silently through the estuaries, families harvested shellfish along the tidal flats, and children learned the rhythms of the tides as naturally as they learned to walk. But the world they had inherited was shifting, and the currents of change were swift and unpredictable. The first force reshaping their world was political. European powers, the English, Dutch, and French, were asserting claims along the coastlines through treaties and charters signed in far-off cities. Decisions made in Amsterdam or London instantly altered the balance of power on the shores where the Wampanoag had lived for centuries. Flags were raised along the beaches, often miles apart, signaling authority over lands the Wampanoag considered theirs. These markings, these declarations were invisible in print, yet tangible in effect. Fishing areas where contested canoe routes became more dangerous and sacred sites were increasingly encroached upon. The elders warned that these lines drawn by outsiders who had never seen the tidal flats could redraw the map of survival itself. A second economic current pressed just as heavily upon the community. Trade routes expanded rapidly, connecting distant ports with once isolated villages. Merchants sought beaver pelts, timber, and fish, offering metal tools, knives, and beads in return. Each exchange carried potential wealth, yet also risk. Access to trade could strengthen a village, but imbalance might provoke envy, spark rivalry with neighboring tribes, or invite further European interference. Canoes laden with goods from distant lands arrived alongside the shores, and every negotiation required careful observation. The Wampanoag had to calculate how much to trade, how much to withhold, and which alliances could be safely maintained. Even a simple act of bartering could shift the invisible borders of influence, changing the paths that would be safe for travel, and the locations where families could gather food. The third social and biological pressure came in the form of disease. Invisible yet deadly smallpox, measles, and influenza traveled silently with the Europeans, leaving devastation in their wake. Families that had survived generations of winter storms and maritime challenges now faced mortality they could not foresee or control. Villages relocated temporarily, elders passed on knowledge urgently, and communities adapted in ways that were both subtle and immediate. Each loss reshaped the network of relationships, forcing the Wampanoag to rethink how they moved, where they fished, and which allies they could rely upon. Survival demanded constant vigilance, the careful monitoring of every visitor, and a new awareness that even a small encounter could ripple through generations. These three currents, political maneuvering, economic expansion, and biological threat, converged to create a fractured map. Land that had once been stable and reliable became a fluid space of opportunity and danger. Canoes once paddled freely along familiar estuaries now required scouts to chart safe passages. Fishing grounds were contested not just by neighbors, but by the invisible force of European authority. Sacred groves and ceremonial spaces could no longer be assumed secure. Every sunrise brought new calculations, which paths were still safe, which alliances could be maintained, and how to preserve the knowledge of ancestors in the face of disruption. The consequences for daily life were immediate. Elders convened councils to discuss boundaries and access. Scouts were dispatched to observe both strangers and neighboring tribes, relaying intelligence through smoke signals or runners along the shoreline. Families moved their seasonal camps to maintain access to fresh water and food. Children were taught early to distinguish between familiar vessels and foreign ones approaching the shore. Every choice from where to plant a fire to which canoe route to take was informed by these converging forces. The Atlantic shores were no longer simply a home. They were a contested space subject to decisions made thousands of miles away. Maps drawn in distant offices, treaties signed in foreign courts, and trade agreements concluded in distant harbors all had direct impact on who controlled the rivers, who harvested the fish, and who would survive to tell the stories of these lands. The Wampanoag, guided by centuries of experience and the vigilance of leaders like Moshop, adapted, continuously aware that every sunrise might bring a new challenge, and every wave along the estuary could carry both sustenance and threat. Moshop was born in 1589, the eldest son of a Wampanoag chieftain, a line of leaders who had guided their people through generations of tides, storms, and seasonal migrations. From his earliest memories, the Atlantic shores were both playground and classroom. He learned to recognize the subtle signs of changing tides, the flight patterns of birds signaling incoming weather, and the hidden passages through marshes where fish ran thick in spring and eels hid beneath silted sandbanks. Every lesson was woven into the land itself, each step along the shore, a thread connecting him to ancestors whose voices still whispered in the rustle of reeds and the lap of waves. By the age of 12, Moshop had accompanied elders on expeditions learning the art of navigation through estuaries with a precision born of observation and patience. By 15, he had seen the first signs of disease brought by strangers, smallpox and measles, cutting down neighbors and kin, leaving gaps in families and deep silences in villages. These early losses instilled in him not only a knowledge of survival, but a responsibility toward the community, a burden he would carry into adulthood. His tools were modest but meaningful. A carved wooden paddle worn smooth from countless trips along tidal flats and river mouths served both as a tool for maneuvering canoes and as a symbol of authority and expertise. His cloak of tanned deerskin, heavy with the scent of smoke from village fires and the brine of the sea, marked him as both leader and participant in daily life. Every object he carried was practical, yet it carried the weight of tradition and expectation. Moshop's responsibilities extended beyond simple leadership. He was a mediator, a scout, and an interpreter of the land. His younger brother, skilled in observation and stealth, often returned with news of strangers along the coast or movements of neighboring tribes. Elders relied on Moshop to translate their knowledge into action, whether it was negotiating boundaries, planning seasonal hunts, or preparing defenses against unexpected intrusions. Women and children depended on his decisions to ensure their safety and the continuity of daily routines, from preparing food to maintaining shelters along the shoreline. Each decision, no matter how small, rippled outward, affecting every life within the village. His motivations were intertwined with both survival and the preservation of culture. He sought to protect the lands his ancestors had navigated for decades, to ensure that the stories, practices, and sacred spaces of the Wampanoag endured. He feared the unknown, the sudden appearance of ships, the foreign speech, the unfamiliar tools and weapons that carried both trade and threat. Yet he also understood opportunity, the chance to secure goods that could sustain the community, to negotiate alliances that might strengthen their position, to learn from newcomers while guarding against their encroachment. Each encounter required a delicate balance of caution, intelligence, and foresight. Even the most mundane tasks carried significance. Inspecting nets for holes or tying a canoe securely against rising tides was not merely functional, it was strategy. Observing the movement of birds and the patterns of waves provided warnings of approaching weather or potential visitors. Each action reinforced the network of knowledge that allowed the Wampanoag to survive and thrive despite mounting external pressures. Moshop's relationships shaped his decisions as much as the physical environment. He had to balance the counsel of elders, the energy of young warriors, the needs of families, and the ambitions of neighbors. His actions represented the community as much as himself. Every decision, whether to send scouts, approach strangers, relocate a camp, or maintain silence, was a statement of leadership and stewardship. By 1621, Moshop had emerged as a central figure, a guiding presence whose choices would influence not only immediate survival, but the long-term preservation of culture, knowledge, and land. The arrival of European ships, the invisible threat of disease, and the shifting dynamics of neighboring tribes constantly tested his judgment. He navigated these challenges with a blend of inherited wisdom and personal experience, aware that the survival of the village depended on vigilance, observation, and decisive action. He was human, vulnerable to doubt and fear, yet bound by duty. Each decision carried consequences: the safety of children, the protection of sacred sites, the continuity of fishing grounds, and the endurance of oral histories. He felt the weight of responsibility, keenly knowing that every choice could reverberate across generations. Yet he also understood that leadership was not only about reacting to threats, but about anticipating them, preparing the community, and guiding it through uncertainty with clarity and courage. Through Moshup, the Wampanoag saw the embodiment of their collective knowledge and values. His presence ensured that the community remained cohesive, alert, and adaptable. Canoes moved through estuaries with careful precision. Children learned from example. Elders passed on teachings with renewed urgency. Each ritual, each routine, each observation of the natural world was intertwined with leadership, demonstrating how survival culture and vigilance were inseparable in a world increasingly influenced by forces from beyond the shore. And so, as tensions along the Atlantic shores mounted, Moshup's role became ever more central. The arrival of strangers, the shifting patterns of trade, the unseen threat of disease all demanded a leader capable of foresight, patience, and decisive action. He represented continuity, wisdom, and protection, a figure whose choices would shape not only the immediate moments, but the enduring narrative of his people. June 14, 1621. The morning air hung heavy with mist and the sharp scent of the Atlantic. Moshup's scouts positioned along the ridges overlooking the estuary signaled urgently. A single sail appeared on the horizon unlike any that had been seen before. Its hull cut through the water, with purpose, the flag unfurling in the wind colors and symbols unfamiliar. The Wampanoag recognized immediately that this was no ordinary trading vessel. Its arrival was deliberate and its intentions uncertain. The village stirred with silent urgency. Women gathered children behind low dunes, elders convened near the central fire, and Moshup called his council to assess the situation. The vessel advanced toward the estuary's mouth, a crucial fishing and canoe route. Every second counted. Hesitation could allow the strangers to establish a foothold in territory that had been the lifeblood of the Wampanoag for generations. The first encounters were subtle yet tense. A small canoe paddled by young men scouting the river drifted too close to the vessel. Shouts from the strangers caused a moment of frozen uncertainty. A single gesture, a pointing hand toward the shore, was interpreted as a territorial claim. Families recoiled, elders whispered urgent counsel, and children were quietly ushered away. The atmosphere shifted from routine to charged anticipation. The spark of confrontation had ignited. Moshup acted quickly. He dispatched scouts to shadow the strangers along the estuary, while positioning his men strategically on higher ground. Canoes were hidden among reeds, and every village movement was carefully coordinated. At the same time, daily routines, food preparation, water collection, tending fires, continued maintaining a semblance of normalcy while preparing for immediate action. Every choice was calculated, balancing the need to protect the village against the risk of provoking open conflict. As the day progressed, the strangers began unloading supplies, staking temporary markers along the beach. Moshup watched closely, recognizing the symbolic weight of each action. To the Wampanoag, the planting of stakes, the placement of barrels, the careful measurement of terrain signaled not neutrality but assertion of control. The community's vigilance intensified. Families moved to higher ground, nets were secured, and the youngest children were kept close, guided by parents and elders alike. The arrival of a single ship triggered a series of cascading decisions. Messages were sent to neighboring villages, smoke signals marking the estuary as a point of heightened attention. Alliances were quietly reinforced, and elders reminded the younger generation of past encounters, of lessons learned from previous intrusions. Moshup's leadership was tested not in battle, but in strategy, anticipation, and the coordination of the community under pressure. Every observation became vital. The positioning of barrels, the pattern of footsteps in the sand, the sound of hammering or distant voices were all noted, interpreted, and relayed. Children learned to recognize the difference between familiar local activity and the subtle movements of strangers. Canoes moved with precision through estuaries that had once been traversed casually. Paths were calculated to avoid confrontation unless necessary. The village adapted in real time, guided by the knowledge and foresight of its leaders. By evening, Moshup convened the council again. Each report from the scouts, each observation from the shoreline was analyzed. Decisions about the following days, whether to engage, observe, or retreat, were informed by the day's events. The spark had been lit, but the flames were still under careful control, a balance of vigilance and restraint. This morning illustrated a truth the Wampanoag had always known: the arrival of outsiders, even a single ship, could upend the rhythm of life, demand immediate action and force choices, with consequences that could ripple across families, villages, and seasons. The community's response was rapid, deliberate, and unified, guided by Moshup's knowledge, experience, and instinct. In a few hours, the estuary was no longer a simple waterway. It was a line of observation, a place of negotiation, a space where the balance of power was tested. The choices made in these early moments would define not just the village's immediate safety, but its ability to maintain control over ancestral lands, resources, and the knowledge that had been passed through generations. It was the early morning of June 15, 1621, just as the fog lifted from the Atlantic shores. The tide was low, revealing the sprawling flats and marshes that threaded through the estuaries. Canoes lined the shallows, their wooden hulls glinting wet from the previous night's dew. Moshop stood at the forefront of the village, scanning the horizon where the foreign vessel had anchored just beyond the mouth of the river. The Wampanoag were about to assert their presence to navigate both diplomacy and defense across a landscape that was as familiar to them as their own breath, yet fraught with peril. The objectives were clear on both sides. The Europeans sought to secure a foothold along the estuary, to establish a temporary trading post, and to chart the coastline for future settlement. They carried barrels of supplies, stakes for marking territory, and armed sailors ready to defend what they perceived as a rightful claim. The Wampanoag, led by Moshop, aimed to protect ancestral fishing grounds, maintain sovereignty over sacred sites, and prevent an incursion that could compromise the community's safety. Every action taken by either side could alter the balance in real time. The terrain dictated strategy as much as intent. Marshes ran deep in treacherous mud, swallowing the legs of any unfamiliar traveler who attempted to traverse it without guidance. Sandbanks shifted with the tide, creating natural barriers and hidden channels that could be used to approach or evade detection. The forest bordering the flats offered cover for scouts and a vantage point for observation, but it also concealed risks, for every shadow might hide the unknown. Moshop had taught his scouts to read every ripple in the water, every pattern of birds taking flight, and every unusual movement along the dunes. The Wampanoag deployed swiftly. Canoes slipped silently along narrow waterways hidden among reeds. Scouts moved through the forest with careful precision, signaling with hand gestures learned over a lifetime. Children and elders were relocated to secure zones, while the central fire in the village remained burning, a signal of vigilance. Moshop's plan relied on detailed knowledge of the terrain: small channels for ambush, deep pools for escape, elevated ridges for surveillance. The land itself was both ally and adversary. Early in the morning, the first turning moment emerged. A miscalculation by the European crew, their larger vessel grounding on a sandbar previously unnoticed, caused a ripple of confusion. Supplies toppled, small boats jostled against each other, and the crew scrambled to prevent loss. Observing from the dunes, Moshop realized this was an opportunity. Signals were sent silently to the scouts hidden along the marshes: approach with caution, take note of movements, do not engage unless necessary. Every eye on the village monitored the vessel's activity, and every step was dictated by the geography beneath their feet. The situation intensified as the tide began to rise. Channels once deep enough for small canoes became shallow, forcing the Wampanoag to adjust their paths. A sudden gust of wind swept across the flats, scattering smoke from cooking fires, temporarily obscuring vision and masking movements. These natural factors became decisive. They dictated who could advance, who could retreat, and who had the advantage of observation. A seemingly minor shift in wind direction altered sightlines and forced rapid recalibration of positions. As the morning unfolded, the Europeans attempted to plant their stakes along the estuary, signaling control over territory. Moshop's scouts noted the precise locations and reported back. Using small canoes and knowledge of hidden channels, the Wampanoag repositioned themselves to maintain surveillance without direct confrontation. The Europeans, unaware of the observers hidden in reeds and along the forest edge, made strategic choices based on incomplete information, reinforcing the Wampanoag's advantage without firing a single shot. The day's events hinged on a combination of human decision and natural circumstance. A fallen tree along the ridge, unnoticed until the Europeans approached, delayed a landing party. A sudden change in tide forced retreat of a small skiff, creating chaos among the strangers and giving the Wampanoag time to regroup. Each element, terrain, tide, wind, and forest cover, contributed to the unfolding drama, demonstrating that knowledge of the land was as decisive as any weapon. By midday, the first tactical outcomes were clear. The Europeans were forced to adjust their plans, moving supplies cautiously and relying on familiar paths, while the Wampanoag controlled critical observation points. The balance of the encounter had shifted subtly but decisively. There were no casualties yet. The Wampanoag had achieved strategic control through understanding of terrain coordination and timing. Families remained safe, fishing grounds were temporarily secured, and Moshop's leadership had prevented escalation into violence. This initial engagement illustrated the intimate interplay between intent, terrain, and timing. The Wampanoag leveraged their environment, turning natural obstacles into strategic assets. Every creek, ridge, and marsh became part of a living map, guiding decisions and constraining the movements of those unfamiliar with the land. The outcome of the day did not come from brute force, but from deep knowledge, coordination, and the ability to respond to unexpected shifts in conditions, a lesson that would shape all subsequent encounters along the Atlantic shores. By evening, Moshop convened a council once more. Observations were shared, channels marked for future monitoring, and contingencies for rising tides were discussed. The village had survived the first major test. The European vessel remained, yet it had been contained by the Wampanoag's use of terrain timing and strategy. The stage was set for the next series of decisions, and the balance of power along the estuary had already been altered not through combat, but through mastery of the land and the moments that turned the tide. The events of June 15th along the estuary left impressions that would be recorded in very different ways by those who witnessed them. To the Wampanoag, the day was a controlled exercise in vigilance, a demonstration of knowledge, preparation, and strategy. To the European crew, it was a mismanaged, tense encounter punctuated by confusion and uncertainty. The contrast between these accounts would later become a source of tension in the historical record, revealing not only the clash of perspectives, but also the differing priorities and understandings of each side. Moshop's account, preserved in oral histories passed down through generations and later recorded by early chroniclers, emphasized coordination and prudence. The scouts moved silently through reeds, observing the strangers without engagement. Canoes followed hidden channels, positioning themselves for observation rather than attack. Every action was deliberate, ensuring the safety of families, children, and elders. According to these accounts, no lives were lost, no conflict escalated to violence, and the village maintained control over the territory, while demonstrating to the newcomers that the land was watched and defended. In contrast, a log kept by the European captain painted a very different picture. The document, later filed with his superiors in London, described the Wampanoag as hostile, unpredictable, and aggressive, asserting that the landing party had faced constant harassment from the shoreline. The captain reported that their efforts to establish a temporary post were obstructed, claiming that the natives had moved swiftly and strategically, creating obstacles that made the mission nearly impossible to complete without confrontation. In his words, the Europeans were cautious, constrained not by knowledge of the land, but by the uncooperative and seemingly threatening behavior of the indigenous people. The divergence in these two accounts is striking. One emphasizes restraint, community protection, and environmental mastery. The other portrays obstruction and implicit threat, framing the Wampanoag's vigilance as antagonism. The differences reveal not simply errors in perception, but fundamentally contrasting worldviews. For Moshop and his people, the estuary was home, a network of resources, paths, and sacred spaces to be defended subtly. For the Europeans, the same actions were interpreted through the lens of ownership, control, and territorial expansion, creating a narrative in which the Wampanoag were obstacles rather than inhabitants defending their homeland. These accounts converge in only one verifiable detail: the presence of both parties along the estuary at the same time. Beyond that, the interpretation diverges sharply. Moshop's version focused on the efficiency and precision of scouts, the use of terrain for observation, and the careful orchestration of movement to avoid unnecessary conflict. The European report emphasized confusion, missteps, and the need to adapt to a supposedly hostile landscape. The Wampanoag accounted for every movement as intentional and informed. The Europeans recorded every obstacle as unexpected and threatening. Underlying this conflict is a deeper understanding of purpose. The Wampanoag were not attempting to challenge the strangers for conquest. They sought to safeguard vital resources, protect families, and uphold traditions in a landscape that had been their own for generations. The Europeans, operating under a framework of expansion and claim, interpreted any form of delay or adjustment as resistance, a challenge to authority. The same events, observed from different vantage points and through distinct cultural lenses, produced records that would later appear contradictory, even incompatible. The consequences of these differing accounts were significant. Future interactions along the estuary were informed not only by what happened on June 15th, but by how each side recorded and interpreted it. The European perception of aggression justified, in their view, stricter measures, more vigilant patrols, and a presumption of potential hostility. For the Wampanoag, understanding that outsiders might misinterpret their actions reinforced the need for careful communication, observation, and the strategic use of terrain. Each side's subsequent actions were shaped as much by perception as by reality. Oral testimonies recall how Moshop and the elders debriefed the community at the day's end, recounting movements, noting which paths were safe and which approaches could be compromised in future encounters. These narratives stressed precision, shared knowledge, and communal responsibility. Conversely, European letters and logs sent to distant officials emphasized the challenge of negotiating unknown territory and the perceived risk posed by the indigenous presence. One account framed the Wampanoag as a disciplined, knowledgeable society operating in harmony with the land. The other framed them as obstructive and threatening a hindrance to commerce and claim. The tension between these records illustrates a fundamental principle. History is mediated not just by what happened, but by who records it and why. The same day, the same location, and the same sequence of movements produced accounts that at first glance seemed irreconcilable. Yet both are accurate in their own context, reflecting priorities, perceptions, and cultural frameworks rather than simple fact versus fiction. Moshop's leadership was further validated through this juxtaposition. While Europeans interpreted the Wampanoag as unpredictable, the village had executed a flawless operation according to their own terms, preserving safety, asserting vigilance, and maintaining territorial integrity without direct conflict. The discrepancy in perception highlighted not failure, but strategic success under scrutiny from an outside lens. In the end, the June 15th encounter along the estuary stands as a case study in interpretation, perspective, and cultural framing. One side's narrative emphasized obstacle and threat, while the other emphasized coordination and protection. Both accounts in their divergence underscore the importance of context, terrain, timing, knowledge of the land, and the priorities of the community. The Wampanoag had acted decisively, guided by generations of experience and Moshop's leadership. The Europeans had interpreted the same movements through the prism of ownership and expected compliance. In the pages of European logs and the whispers of Wampanoag oral tradition, the same events are rendered in parallel realities, a single day, two stories, and a conflict of understanding that would echo through the histories of the Atlantic shores for generations. By the following morning, June 16, 1621, the estuary had transformed into a stage of heightened tension. Fog lingered along the marshes, thick and damp, swallowing distant sounds and obscuring visibility. Canoes moved cautiously through the hidden channels, their paddlers alert to the faintest ripple, the slightest motion of reeds that could betray the presence of strangers. Moshop led a contingent of scouts, their feet barely making a sound, eyes scanning every bend and inlet. Families in the village followed a rhythm dictated by vigilance and necessity. Women carried woven baskets of food to secure locations, elders tended fires that would signal observation points across the flats, and children clung close, learning by example. The delicate balance between daily routine and readiness. The soundscape was alive, the slap of paddles against water, the call of a distant gull, the whisper of wind through the reeds, each layered with the quiet tension of anticipation. The European vessel remained anchored just beyond the river mouth, its crew preparing for a day of landing and surveying. They moved with purpose, unloading supplies and staking claims, unaware that they were being watched at every step. Moshop's men observed silently, cataloging movements, noting patterns and relaying information to the village. The landscape itself became an ally, the tide controlling access, marshes hiding positions, wine scattering scents and masking footsteps. Every element of terrain was leveraged to maintain advantage without engaging prematurely. By midday, the situation escalated. A small group of Europeans attempted to approach the main channel carrying barrels and tools. Scouts signaled Moshop, who directed a measured response, a simultaneous maneuver along concealed paths to intercept and observe while ensuring families remained distant from potential danger. The coordination required split-second timing, understanding of tides, and intimate knowledge of every turn and bend in the waterway. Meanwhile, life in the village continued under the shadow of these movements. A mother guided her children along a narrow path to a safe marshland, carrying a small bundle of food wrapped in animal hide. The smell of smoked fish mingled with the salt air, a sensory reminder of survival and sustenance. An elder sat on a ridge, weaving reeds into mats, while keeping a watchful eye on both scouts and strangers, the rhythm of hands moving over fibers, a counterpoint to the tension of the day. These everyday tasks, mundane yet critical, were inseparable from the unfolding strategic operations. As the European group advanced, they misjudged the depth of the marsh channels, forcing canoes to backtrack awkwardly. This mistake created a crucial window for Moshop's scouts, who maneuvered silently to flank positions and relay signals to the village. The natural obstacles, shifting sands, concealed inlets, reeds thick with morning dew, amplified the Wampanoag's advantage. Observation points provided both intelligence and a measure of psychological pressure, demonstrating control without a single direct confrontation. A sudden gust of wind from the northwest swept across the estuary, carrying with it the scent of seaweed and salt spray. Smoke from the village fires twisted and drifted unpredictably, offering concealment while also signaling readiness. Moshop adjusted positions, recalibrating the placement of scouts along the dunes and directing canoes to channels that had previously been less monitored. Each adjustment was a choreography informed by the landscape, weather, and human activity alike. At the same time, a European landing party attempted to establish a temporary camp near the edge of the tidal flats. Canoes brimming with supplies slipped into shallows, men stepping carefully through sand and silt, unfamiliar with the hidden traps of the marsh. Observers from the Wampanoag calculated distances, noting every misstep and hesitation. Families watched from afar, children learning the rhythms of caution, women preparing food caches for potential relocation. Every human action, whether cautious or routine, was intertwined with the strategic calculations unfolding across the estuary. The turning point arrived mid-afternoon. A miscalculation by the Europeans, a misjudged tide that grounded a small skiff carrying barrels, forced them to pause and realign. Moshop seized the moment, sending a small group to relay signals through the marshes, ensuring all scouts and observers were repositioned to monitor the stranded crew. This maneuver maintained the balance of control the Wampanoag observed and influenced outcomes without direct violence, leveraging both human coordination and environmental conditions. The day's escalation demonstrated the interplay between terrain timing and human behavior. It was not solely the knowledge of the land, nor the vigilance of scouts, nor the presence of outsiders that dictated outcomes. It was the fusion of all these elements. Canoes navigated narrow channels, children and elders were secured, signals were transmitted invisibly through reeds and smoke, and Moshop coordinated movements with foresight honed over decades of lived experience. By sunset, the European vessel had retreated slightly, repositioning along deeper channels, while the Wampanoag maintained control of the flats and observation points. The village breathed a collective sigh of relief, yet the tension remained. Families returned to their homes, meals were prepared, fires tended, but the day's lessons were seared into memory. Knowledge of terrain, careful timing, and coordinated human effort could shape outcomes as effectively as force. This sequence of events was both a demonstration of strategy and a portrait of daily life under pressure. The ordinary baskets of food-woven mats, children learning to paddle was inseparable from the extraordinary. The orchestration of scouts, the anticipation of movement, the interpretation of tides and wind. Life and strategy were entwined. The human presence in every gesture and decision determined how the conflict would unfold. The day ended with Moshop convening the village council, reviewing every movement, assessing observations, and planning contingencies for the coming hours. Families settled into temporary shelters, scouts prepared for night patrols, and the knowledge that the estuary was once again secured for another cycle of tides and tasks brought a quiet satisfaction. The balance had shifted, yet vigilance remained a reminder that the interplay of human action, terrain, and circumstance would define every step along the Atlantic shores. June 17, 1621. The estuary woke under a pale dawn, the air thick with fog and the salt of the Atlantic. Moshop stood atop the ridge overlooking the tidal flats, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of movement. The European vessel remained anchored cautiously beyond the river mouth, its crew aware now of the Wampanoag's vigilance. Today the stakes were higher. Any misstep could ripple into consequences that no one could reverse. The morning began with cautious maneuvering. Canoes slid silently through hidden channels, scouts observing the positions of the strangers while relaying information back to the village. Every rustle in the reeds, every glint of sunlight on distant barrels was catalogued. Families maintained their routines, fires smoked fish. Children gathered shellfish, but every action was now shadowed by the presence of outsiders. The village moved as a single organism, alive with vigilance and discipline. By mid-morning, tension escalated. The Europeans attempted to land supplies closer to the estuary, misjudging water depths and terrain. Canoes carefully positioned by Moshop's scouts flanked the approach, ensuring observation without engagement. The Europeans were forced to pause, readjust, and contend with obstacles they had neither anticipated nor understood. The marsh's tides and hidden channels dictated the rhythm, and the Wampanoag exploited every feature to maintain control. A turning point occurred when a skiff carrying barrels grounded on a sandbar. Crew members scrambled to prevent loss, their movements disorganized. Moshop seized this opportunity. Signals were sent through the reeds, coordinating scouts and repositioning observers along the ridge. The village acted with precision, using knowledge of tides and terrain to influence the situation without firing a single weapon. As the afternoon sun climbed, the tension reached its apex. Smoke from cooking fires twisted in the wind, drifting toward the European vessel and obscuring the precise number of observers. Canoes moved through channels unseen, and the villagers remained hidden, their presence felt but not directly confronted. Every footstep, every paddle stroke, and every glance became part of a living choreography, a silent orchestration of strategy and survival. The Europeans, unaware of the full network of scouts, attempted to push further into the flats carrying stakes and supplies. Misjudgments compounded a sudden shift in tide. Stranded one skiff, another slipped into a deeper channel, and the placement of stakes revealed both their intent and their vulnerability. Moshop's observation points allowed for rapid adjustments, ensuring the safety of families and maintaining control over key territory. The situation had reached a point where direct engagement was unnecessary. The balance of power was dictated by terrain timing and human coordination. By evening, the village convened on the ridge. Reports were shared, paths noted, and contingencies for the coming days were planned. The European vessel remained constrained by shallow waters and vigilant observation. The Wampanoag had demonstrated control without confrontation, turning the estuary itself into a tool of strategy. Families returned to homes, children to beds, and the rhythms of daily life resumed. But the memory of the day's maneuvers and maneuvers yet to come remained vivid. This day marked the point of no return. The estuary, once simply a resource and a passage, had become a contested space, observed, calculated, and defended. Decisions taken in these hours to observe, to maneuver, to position would ripple through subsequent seasons. The Wampanoag had secured territory, maintained safety, and asserted sovereignty through knowledge, coordination, and patience. Yet the European presence recorded in logs would inform future encounters, shaping interpretations, expectations, and eventual treaties. As dusk settled, Moshop walked along the ridge, observing the water, the reeds, and the distant sails. He understood that the moment had closed one chapter and opened another. The estuary was no longer simply home. It was a place where the limits of engagement had been tested, and the consequences were irreversible. The sun sank behind the horizon, casting long shadows across tidal flats, and in that quiet, the village absorbed the reality of the day. A balance achieved, a challenge deferred, and a future shaped by the choices made under fog, salt, and wind. The surviving records, fragmentary and sparse, reflected the complexity of the encounter. European logs detailed confusion and obstruction, while Wampanoag oral histories preserved coordination, vigilance, and the protection of community. Pages end entries, stopgaps remain. The narrative closes here. The estuary, the ridge, the marshes, and the paddles, moving silently through hidden channels, become frozen in the historical memory, marking a decisive moment when control knowledge and terrain determined outcomes in ways that neither side could later reverse. By the spring of 1622, nearly a year after the tense encounter at the estuary, the Wampanoag had begun to navigate a new reality along the Atlantic shores. The estuary, once a familiar and unchallenged passage, now required constant observation and strategic use. Canoe routes were subtly altered, marsh paths, reinforced with markers known only to the village, and fishing grounds shifted to maintain access while minimizing exposure to European vessels. Knowledge of tides, channels, and hidden inlets became even more critical, and Moshop's guidance remained central to the community's safety and continuity. The Europeans, for their part, documented the encounter as a minor obstruction, but their interpretation influenced policies in distant ports. They began to formalize claims, recording boundaries along maps that bore little resemblance to the lived experience of the Wampanoag. These maps, while abstract, had real consequences. They dictated future trade routes, landing zones, and potential settlements. The lines drawn by distant authorities became the first tangible imposition of a new territorial framework, one that would continue to shift the balance of power for decades. Within the Wampanoag community, the encounter prompted tangible changes. Seasonal camps that had previously been predictable were adjusted to avoid repeated contact with European ships. Families relocated to higher ground during certain months, while scouts patrolled alternative channels. Food storage and transport routines adapted to new risks, ensuring that provisions remained secure, even if outsiders attempted access. Children observing these shifts learned the importance of adaptability and vigilance, lessons that would resonate across generations. By 1625, 3 years after the encounter, the estuary itself had become a contested space of indirect influence rather than outright conflict. European traders established small temporary posts further down the river, carefully avoiding direct confrontation but signaling persistent interest in the area. In response, the Wampanoag formalized observation and communication networks. Smoke signals, designated relay points, and coded markers along the channels ensured that any movement along the shorelines was noted, interpreted, and communicated swiftly. The community had adapted, creating a dynamic system of vigilance that preserved autonomy despite external pressures. Longer-term consequences emerged as well. By 1640, 20 years after the initial confrontation, maps produced by European authorities had begun to reflect established settlements, trade routes, and claimed territories. Names assigned by newcomers appeared on charts, yet the Wampanoag continued to use their traditional endonyms within the community and in oral history. Seasonal migrations, sacred grounds, and resource areas were negotiated through a combination of observation, diplomacy, and strategic retreat. Moshop's descendants carried forward the knowledge of safe routes, observation techniques, and community coordination, ensuring that the lessons of the estuary encounter were embedded in the social memory of the tribe. These adjustments, the movement of villages, the establishment of observation networks, the codification of knowledge for future generations, illustrate the tangible impact of the June 1621 events. The estuary, once a place of unchallenged daily life, became a locus of adaptation, resilience, and subtle assertion of autonomy. Every decision, from relocating a family to redirecting a canoe channel, reflected the ongoing negotiation between environmental mastery and the pressures of European presence. In essence, the new map was both literal and metaphorical. The physical landscape remained, yet the social and strategic contours had shifted. Families learned which channels were safest, which marshes offered cover, and which approaches were likely to invite observation or encounter. Territory was defended through knowledge rather than force, and the community's memory preserved both the actions taken and the reasons behind them. Moshop's leadership and that of his successors ensured that this knowledge endured, becoming a living map of strategy, survival, and sovereignty. By 1641, the Atlantic shores had become a landscape defined as much by memory and vigilance as by geography. European maps recorded one reality. Wampanoag knowledge recorded another. The divergence underscored the complex interplay of power, observation, and adaptation that defined the aftermath of the June 1621 encounter. Families thrived, traditions persisted, and the community retained its autonomy even as outsiders recorded their own version of events in ink and parchment. The new map was thus a mosaic of lived experience, strategy, and recorded claims. Each channel ridge and tidal flat carried stories of foresight, observation, and careful action. The Wampanoag's ability to adapt and maintain continuity through shifting political, economic, and environmental pressures ensured that the estuary remained a space of both survival and cultural memory, its contours defined as much by human knowledge as by the tides and reeds of the Atlantic shores. Over the decades that followed the events along the Atlantic shores, the Wampanoag preserved the memory of those encounters in ways both subtle and enduring. The estuary remained a central feature in oral histories, its channels and marshes described not only as resources but as spaces of vigilance, strategy, and community cohesion. Generations recounted how Moshop's leadership had shaped the movement of families, the observation of tides, and the use of hidden waterways, lessons that became embedded in the collective consciousness. Festivals and seasonal gatherings retained their significance. During the autumn harvest, families would assemble along the flats to give thanks for the abundance of clams, fish, and eels. Fires were lit in patterns that reflected traditional knowledge of the land, and songs were sung that echoed the movements of ancestors, the rhythm of paddles, and the vigilance required along the tidal flats. These melodies, passed down from parent to child, carried encoded instructions, reminders of where hidden channels lay, which marshes were safest, and how to move silently along estuary paths. In these traditions, the act of remembering was inseparable from practical survival. Sacred sites and place names persisted. Moshop's Point, a ridge overlooking the estuary where scouts had once watched the European vessel, retained its original Wampanoag name in oral history, even as colonial maps recorded foreign designations. Burial grounds and ceremonial spaces continued to be visited, not merely as ritual acts, but as a living connection to the knowledge and decisions of the past. Each location was a node of memory, a spatial archive where generations recalled both specific events and the principles that guided their community observation, adaptation, and coordination with the rhythms of land and water. By the mid-17th century, the knowledge of the estuary had become codified in layered ways. Elders taught children to read subtle changes in tides, to identify wind shifts by the motion of reeds, and to navigate channels invisible to those unfamiliar with the landscape. Canoes and paddles, fishing nets and seasonal shelters were not merely tools, but instruments of continuity, reinforcing the lessons encoded in stories and songs. These practices, observed quietly along the flats and marshes, represented an enduring thread of resilience, integrating human memory with environmental cues. Scholars examining Wampanoag oral histories centuries later noted the richness of these records. Unlike European maps, which often depicted static boundaries and abstract lines of ownership, the Wampanoag preserved dynamic knowledge of currents, tides, hidden channels, and seasonal cycles. The stories of Moshop, the coordinated observation of outsiders, and the strategic adaptation to environmental conditions exemplify a form of archival memory rooted in lived experience. The estuary itself became a narrative device, a medium through which generations conveyed knowledge of risk resource management and communal responsibility. Today, fragments of these traditions survive. Place names retain original endonyms, songs echo ancestral instructions, and community gatherings continue to honor the rhythms of the seasons and the land. Even as the physical environment has shifted under centuries of human activity, the intangible knowledge of the Wampanoag endures, transmitted through observation, story, and ritual. These surviving threads offer insight not only into past events, but into the interplay of landscape memory and human agency. In reflecting on this legacy, it becomes clear that the Wampanoag did not merely record events. They embedded lessons into the very fabric of their environment, ensuring that survival strategy and cultural knowledge traveled forward with each generation. The estuary, the flats, the ridges, and the marshes are not just geographic features. They are living archives, repositories of collective memory that illustrate how humans interact with place over time. The actions of Moshop and his people, from coordinated scouting to the subtle shifts of camp locations, are encoded in both song and spatial knowledge, forming a record that complements and in many ways surpasses written documents from outside observers. Through these enduring memories, the Atlantic shores continue to speak. They remind us that landscapes are more than physical spaces. They are vessels of human experience, strategy, and adaptation. The Wampanoag's preservation of endonyme ceremonial sites and practical knowledge demonstrates a sophisticated intertwining of land and memory, showing how communities can retain autonomy, identity, and cultural continuity even amid pressures of external claims and environmental uncertainty. As the tides ebb and flow over the estuary today, the song's names and stories persist, a quiet testament to vigilance, adaptability, and the human capacity to encode memory in the land itself. The people who remained have not only witnessed history, but have carried it forward, ensuring that lessons of observation, coordination, and survival continue to resonate across centuries. The Atlantic shores are no longer merely a stage for past conflict. They are a living archive, a testament to the enduring relationship between humans' memory and the landscapes they inhabit. What do you think Moshop's greatest challenge was during those tense days along the estuary? Could you have made the same choices? Share your thoughts below. We want to hear your perspective on these first encounters.